Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science. In this episode we'll be dealing with Thrive as the number 4 what the F moment in the Chris Watts case. Once again, this particular topic is certainly a contender for the number 1 spot. A case can definitely be made that the whole Thrive spiel was an integral part of why this crime happened. If you take away the Thrive, would it have happened? I'm not sure that psychology actually works in reverse. If you're building your case for why the crime happened and you add various burdens, it does work in that respect, because what you're talking about then is stress, right? A lot of people can't understand why Chris Watts did what he did, and can't understand why any murders happen. But it's quite simple. You can stress any person enough, and they will then take an extreme action. And so if you add a lot of stresses to a particular personality, they will eventually reach a breaking point. And when I say breaking point, I don't mean they have a breakdown. I just mean their psychology breaks down and they start to take unusual or extreme actions to fix, in inverted commas, their situation. In this case, you've got the affair, you've got the pregnancy, you've got the financial burden. You've also got the personalities of Shan'ann and Chris Watts rubbing each other the wrong way. You've got their health concerns and so on, and within this whole ecosystem you then also have Thrive. And the irony with Thrive is Thrive should have made things better for the Watts family. In other words, the fact that they were thriving should have meant that they were living happily ever after. And isn't that the impression that Shan'ann was sort of selling? She was selling this happily ever after, and that's what has arguably made this case so compelling, is that Shan'ann was thriving and Chris Watts was thriving and her children were thriving. And so it raises the question, were they? Given that this family is now being annihilated, given the fact that this happily ever after is turned into a nightmare, I think one can sort of seriously ask the question, were they really thriving? And I think a lot of people insist that they were, and then they take that insistence and they say everything is sort of on Chris Watts. He was a monster that we can't understand and we'll never understand it, and it's all inexplicable. That's when you have this sort of schizophrenic reasoning where you put things in little boxes and you label them and you sort of say Shan'ann was perfect, the family were perfect, everything was great, Chris Watts was screwed up and we don't know why he did what he did. Maybe he's got some disorder, right? The reality is that Shan'ann was selling a idea of herself and of the family and of her marriage that wasn't true. They weren't thriving. And we're going to go through this. I'm sure people will shoot down what I say because it's not related to the case and it's not credible. So I'm going to take that argument out of the picture and I'm going to relate it to the discovery. And that way I think we'll be able to see the scale and scope of why Thrive was such a big what the F moment. Essentially we're going to ask quite a few questions and sort of pretend that we don't know the answers to them and just open our minds to possibilities. And some of the questions are, number 1, what is the last thing Shan'ann did before she died? Number 2, was Shan'ann thriving? Number 3, was it only Thrive that she was sort of working on? Were there other MLMs that she was involved with? Number 4, was Thrive kind of a healthy way of life? In other words, was Shan'ann feeling sort of well at the time of her death? Was she healthy? Were all the people that were sort of involved in it, were they well? Were they sort of happy and healthy and also living happily ever after? And this applies to the other thrivers like Nicole Atkinson and Cassie and the others. Were they living happily ever after and thriving, right? Then we also want to look into briefly into the narrative about Thrive and narcissism. It's what's incredible to me is there's this narcissism narrative hovering over the Chris Watts case, and it only hovers over Chris Watts. It's like this small little storm cloud that's about the size of a thought bubble, and what's happening is it just sort of hovers over Chris Watts' head wherever he goes. This narcissism sort of storm cloud, and for me, like a big what the F that has been staining and contaminating this case from the word go is the fact that if you want to talk about narcissism, why aren't you talking about Thrive? Why aren't you talking about this whole idea of improving your life and being happy and getting what you deserve and all those self-loving things that are associated with classic narcissism? Having a better lifestyle, having a better car, looking better, losing weight, getting everything that you want. That's classic narcissism, but no one wants to talk about that with relation to Thrive. So that's just that really beggars belief in terms of this, and it just shows you how there are a lot of people in this case that refuse to think in big areas about this case. They just refuse to talk about big areas, and they refuse to think about them. Then question number 6, what did Kissinger think about Thrive? And I think that's quite a fascinating debate, is when you start looking not at what you think or what I think or what Dr. Phil thinks or what any other pundit thinks about it. The people in this case, what did some of them think about Thrive? What are their views? And then just to acknowledge them, just acknowledge that this is what they thought, and so on. Then that brings us to question number 7. This whole idea that Chris Watts didn't think that he needed to sleep while he was on Thrive. And then finally, question number 8. I'm not going to go into it too much now because it's just something I want to leave for the end as a sort of a twist. But we're going to look at Shan'ann's relationship with her first husband, and then look at what influence Thrive had on her second marriage. And I think people are going to find that quite ironic. Before we get to that, if you've enjoyed these videos or simply found them compelling or interesting or worth listening to or meaningful in some way, maybe you've learned a few things that you haven't seen somewhere else, please do subscribe to the channel. I'm hoping to get to 5,000 subscribers, please share in your networks to help us to get to that point. Obviously, as the subscribers, as those numbers, if those numbers are encouraging, it encourages me to make more videos. I intend to make 10 in this particular series, but I'm also open to suggestions from you guys what you want talked about. Something I do want to address at some point, and if I don't address it, maybe you guys can remind me, but I do want to address the supposed ping on Nicole Kissinger's phone on the morning of the murders. but I want to do it in a slightly different way. I want to deal with it in terms of um, going through her cell phone records and looking at other instances, because that's a very important way to develop a theory on the behaviors. You look at what was their behavior in the weeks leading up to the particular incident, and that gives one a lot of insight. So that's something that I think is quite worth discussing. But yeah, please subscribe, please like this video, please leave a comment, and please share amongst your networks. And now, without any further ado, let's get started. So the first question under this huge Thrive umbrella that we want to interrogate is, what was the last thing Shan'ann did before she died? And I don't mean this question in a very narrow sense. I don't mean, what just before she died, was she in bed? I don't mean it like that. I mean, what was she sort of busy with before she died? And when we look at the Ring doorbell footage, which to me really epitomizes the Chris Watts case. I mean, those 20 or 30 seconds really sum up the entire case. They speak far more, they speak volumes far more so than the sermon on the porch, which was I think 7 or 8 minutes long. And Shan'ann walks past that porch where 2 days later Watts would be standing and sort of putting words in her mouth and making up stories. And the interesting thing is, in that doorbell footage there's no sound, and as I say, that footage speaks volumes. And what it's really saying is, you see the dark, and you see a car pulling up when the whole neighborhood is in darkness and asleep, and Shan'ann is dropped off and the car pulls away, and Shan'ann walks alone to a dark house, and she doesn't know what awaits her. She doesn't know what to expect. She's not apparently expecting anything. And there is something very tragic and sad about this image. You're seeing, on the first layer, you're seeing a woman get out the car and walk into her front door. When you look a little bit closer, Shan'ann's face doesn't look happy. And when you look at that face and you know the story behind this case, you know that she wasn't happy. You know that she'd been sick over the weekend. She hadn't been feeling well. In fact, on the day that she left, she texted Watts to say that she's not sure why she feels weak when she stands. Besides the physical malaise she was going through, she was also troubled. She was unhappy. She was worried. She was worried about her marriage. She was worried that her husband was having an affair. So when we see her walking in, she's carrying that burden on her shoulders. And yet, where she's come from is she's come from a Thrive conference. She's come from a kind of a get-together to celebrate or to, promote this whole idea of thriving. And yet, this little picture is the opposite of that. It's almost 2 o'clock in the morning. Shan'ann is about to lose her life. She's about to die. She's a pregnant woman with a 15-week-old fetus, and both of them are about to die. It's the opposite of thriving. It's a disaster. It's a catastrophe. It is a dark demise. It is. It's a disaster, and this is the final sort of moments we see of Shan'ann returning from like a Thrive extravaganza. Again, I know people will criticize one saying that Shan'ann didn't look great when she arrived home. But what they don't see when you make that comment is it's said in sympathy that she is arriving home exhausted, tired, run down, sort of she's been poisoned over time. I believe that that's true. And so she's been undermined. She's in a very weak place. She's physically weak, mentally weak. She's been dealing with a husband that's been sort of lying to her, cheating on her, fooling her, giving her the runaround, and she's broken down, right? And that's not meant in a negative way. It's meant in a that is the reality. And the end of that breaking down was that she was murdered. And the sad aspect to this, and it, when you acknowledge that Shan'ann was in a bad place, she wasn't thriving, she was struggling. She wasn't thriving, she was trying to survive. She was trying to survive financially. In fact, I think in a message to one of her friends, she said, I can't survive financially with 3 kids in Colorado. Shan'ann's exact words are, I can't afford 3 kids alone in Colorado, and that's on page 635 of the Discovery documents. But it comes down to the same thing. If you can't afford your family, you're not thriving, you're not surviving, you're not making it, you're not making ends meet. And so this image we get of Shan'ann arriving home really speaks volumes about the whole thriving thing. It's sort of an inversion of it. It's the dark reflection of it. It's the reality of Thrive. And the reality is, going on a trip, returning home alone, going on the trip alone, returning home alone, and then disaster afterwards. At some unknown time afterwards, there's disaster, there's catastrophe. And an open question I have is, Shan'ann may have lost her life, she may have been murdered, but other people on Thrive, doesn't the same thing happen to them in some way or another? Don't they also lose their lives? Don't they also lose their, the husbands of Thrivers, don't they also lose their wives? Don't they lose them to these MLM scams? What else do they lose? Do they lose their incomes, and do they lose their happily ever afters? That's an open question. And so just to finalize this particular question, and again, people will be upset by the way that this question is even framed, even the mere fact that you say it. But the fact is, when we see Shan'ann in that doorbell footage, we kind of see a different Shan'ann. We don't see the Shan'ann that we've seen on Facebook. We don't see someone who's made up and well dressed and thriving. We don't see that. We see another Shan'ann. And yes, of course it's understandable. It's 2 o'clock in the morning. She's pregnant. She's exhausted. But that's the point. That is the point. The point is that there are 2 Shan'anns. There's the Shan'ann on Thrive that is happy and successful and well and healthy and happily married, and she loves her husband. But then there's also another Shan'ann, right? And we get a tiny little glimpse of this other Shan'ann just before she dies. That's tragic. I mean, that is really sad. And it's really sad for Shan'ann that, if Shan'ann had acknowledged what was going on in her life, maybe she wouldn't have gone on that trip. And we know that she was she was in two minds in going, and Chris Watts actually convinced her to go. Right? You know, a case can also be made that if Shan'ann didn't go on that trip, that either Chris Watts would have lost his nerve in carrying out the crime, or that it would have been delayed, and then maybe things would have changed. Maybe, conceivably, Kissinger would have found out that his wife was pregnant and dropped him like a hot potato. You know, if there was just a little bit more time, if Shan'ann hadn't gone on the trip, one can imagine the relationship he was having with Kissinger was hanging by a thread. And if Shan'ann had just done the gender reveal, what else would she have done if she didn't go away that weekend? What else would she have done? She would have done the gender reveal. And then Watts' game would have been up. Also, if she hadn't gone away, she would have been able to fully confront and finish the argument that they were having, and get a proper answer from Watts, because the fact that Watts knew she was heading back to Arizona meant that he could sort of postpone the argument, and he postponed it by simply saying, okay, no, I will do marriage counseling, and I think I do love you, and he did give her a kiss or something, and that was a way of manipulating her to buy himself time. If Shan'ann never went away on the trip, she wouldn't have been able to buy any time. And, you know, there was also the birthday party. Shan'ann would have been expected to be at that birthday party. So she would already have been missed if something had happened on Sunday night. So a huge case can be made that, you know, the whole Thrive thing, if Shan'ann didn't go, she would still be alive. And that isn't that an irony? Is that this tug of war between the Thrive and Shan'ann being alive? Question 2: was Shan'ann thriving? And this again is a question that we can be very simplistic about. One can say she wasn't. One can say, you know, her marriage was in trouble, her finances were in trouble, they were about to lose their home, she wasn't feeling well, and one can argue that that didn't have anything to do with Thrive. But, you know, even if we go a lot further back, Shan'ann wasn't very well. She wasn't a very healthy person. And when she was in North Carolina, she spoke about spotting, and it's difficult to say how much was related to other things, but one doesn't get an idea of the picture of health with Shan'ann as one does with Chris Watts. And I think a better way of addressing this is the children. You know, the children were said to be really sickly, and this comes across quite a lot. You see it in a lot of photos, but the children certainly weren't a picture of health. The one person who seemed to be the picture of health in the story was Chris Watts. He seemed to be getting the best of Thrive. You know, he was losing the most weight. He was looking the best, and he was the one that cheated on his wife. Why? Because in the scenario of the marriage, he must have felt Shan'ann wasn't attractive enough for him. I don't really want to get into that aspect, but he was definitely, in his own terms, he was looking better than he was probably in the shape of his life. Shan'ann was also looking good. Shan'ann was also, prior to falling pregnant, Shan'ann had also lost weight, but Chris Watts was definitely, if anyone was thriving in the whole community, whether it's the Thayers or the Atkinsons or the Rosenbergs or any of the other thrivers, the one that was standing head and shoulders above everyone else in terms of thriving was Chris. And so another aspect to look into it, and this brings us to question number 3, was it only Thrive? Was Shan'ann only involved with Thrive in terms of multi-level marketing? And we see that she wasn't. She was involved in Unique and Lula, what's it, Lula Ray? So it's Lula Rowe, and various other, there were quite a few that she was involved in. And one of the tricks that multi-level marketers try to pull is they will create a sort of a community of followers or whatever, of people that they have under them or their members or whatever, and then they jump into another multi-level marketing scheme, and then they just convert all those people into the same thing, and then again, in something else. And the idea then is that you triple or quadruple your earnings by instantly amassing quite a big membership base under yourself. As far as I know, that's illegal, or that's not allowed in terms of multi-level marketing, but I think it's done. I don't think anyone stops them, and I don't think anyone really makes any money out of that. You sort of have instant members, but everyone is buying from everybody else, which means you're also buying from somebody else, and the people who are getting wealthy are the guys right at the top who get the membership money, and all the sales are negligible. The sales are, in terms of earning money, are negligible, of course, but making the sales, a lot of that money also goes straight to the top. So the amount of money that these people actually make is very little, but there's a compelling psychology where it looks like when you reach this level you'll get a car, and when you reach that level you'll get a this or a that, and it kind of works like gambling. You're anticipating getting some kind of jackpot, but it's always delayed. It's always kind of postponed. And it's the same with multi-level marketing. You're always told that the finish line is just ahead, and you're going to get something. And people are inspired by things like trips and cars and sort of dollar amounts. But what's less sexy is being told, well, this is your monthly salary, and that's what they end up never getting. Is the multi-level marketers never really get a proper base salary that can kind of see them through. Right, we're now at 28 minutes into this episode, and I want to start anchoring this discussion in the discovery. And what we see is that there are 87 references to Thrive in the discovery, and we're going to go through them systematically and chronologically. The first reference is on page 457 on the discovery, and it refers to Cindy DeRosset, and she was in Scottsdale, Arizona. Excuse me. According to DeRosset, Shan'ann arrived on the morning of Friday, August 10th, at a work conference for Laval/Thrive at the Embassy Suites Hotel in Scottsdale, Arizona. That's the first reference to her. Interestingly, DeRosset is also the contact that the Colorado Bureau of Investigation used to get samples of Thrive product, which they wanted to test in the lab. They wanted to actually perform chemical tests to see what they were dealing with. Right now, so going through the discovery, we get different kinds of comments and views and insights into Thrive from the actual people at the center of this. And that's really useful to see, and useful to, if we're going to talk about it, it's useful to take their comments as a starting off point instead of us projecting our own feelings about it, looking at what they saying and what they observed with Shan'ann and Chris. If you go to page 461 of the Discovery, it's a transcript of the interview with Jeremy Lindstrom and his wife Jennifer, and there's a quick mention that both Jeremy and Jennifer thought that Shan'ann had found the right person for her, because she's a type A personality and Chris was type B. So Shan'ann was like a specific kind of person, and in Chris she'd found the right guy that suited her, and it kind of worked. Jennifer said that Bella and Celeste have a regimented schedule and a consistent routine that they follow at bedtime. This also gives us insight into Shan'ann. She had also kind of a regimented routine in her Thrive videos, and then where she planned to go. She knew well in advance when she was going to go to various conferences and things. And I think this played into her. Shan'ann had a disciplined aspect to herself. But the problem with being regimented is you kind of get into a rut, and you can't necessarily see outside of that rut. And one can make the argument that because Shan'ann was so regimented in her thinking and so consistent in her routines, she didn't know how to deal with what's having an affair, which was something I think she just didn't expect. Even when confronted with it, she wasn't able to kind of think about it. She wasn't able to admit it. She wasn't able to reason with herself. She seemed to kind of be in denial, and what she then defaulted to was her regimented schedule. She went to North Carolina regardless. She went to the Thrive thing in Arizona regardless. When her husband wasn't really communicating with her much, she didn't return. She just stayed on her schedule. There's a lot more to say about that. If you have a autoimmune disease like lupus, it's something that is going to worry you. You're worried about your mortality, you're worried about death, and you find secure, you find safety and security in things that you can rely on, and one of them is having a schedule, having this idea that the world can be reduced to a timetable, and you know what to expect from that world. And so Chris, having his affair, he was operating outside of that timetable. And if you think of the whole Thrive thing, it's all regimented, it's all scheduled, and I think this is why Shan'ann was a natural at it. I think she loved the layers of it. She loved the scheduling of conferences, and the you've got to do so many Thrive lives a month or whatever, and she liked that aspect. According to Jeremy and Jennifer, they said that Shan'ann is very consistent and has been doing very well with her Thrive business because she's consistent and follows through. One wonders again what that means. Like, how do they know she'd been doing very well? Well, isn't it because Shan'ann was telling them she's doing very well? So, if she says she's doing very well, does that mean she is doing very well? Or is that simply what she's saying? And we know towards the end of her life, she was talking about how much she was doing, how much energy she had. Meanwhile, Nutgate was going on behind the scenes, and she wasn't so happy. In terms of Chris Watts, she wasn't consistent. She didn't follow through with her concerns about him. And then going further, Jeremy said that prior to Shan'ann starting with Thrive, she and Chris struggled some financially. So there's this impression that before she started Thrive, they were struggling financially, but they were doing well on Thrive. And he goes on to say that their company paid for their car, and Shan'ann won several trips. But what if that's not true? What if when they went on trips the company paid half, or the accommodation was free but they still had to pay for their flights, or they didn't have to pay for the food, or they did have to pay for the food but the accommodation was free or something like that. I don't know, some kind of perk, but it's certainly not just everything being free. You must think of it from the company's point of view. The company's got to pay for hundreds of people going on these things. Where are they getting the money? Well, they're getting it from these people, from their memberships, from their inexhaustible selling to one another. But they're not going to pay for everything. They're going to pay some kind of incentive to get these people to go on the trips. But it's got to work out for Thrive. It's got to work out for Lavelle to make it worth their while as well. They've got to make a profit out of sending these people on the trips. Jeremy also talks about, in the same sentence, about how well they were doing financially after starting with Thrive, that they were somewhat frugal and that they cut coupons at one point. And again, that doesn't sketch this image of someone who can afford this mansion and this expensive car and this expensive school. Almost in the same breath that they talk about doing so well with Thrive, but then also being frugal and cutting coupons, there's this talk of Shan'ann and Chris planning on going to Aspen for the weekend. You know, they're constantly going on trips. Shanann's just come back from Arizona, now she's going to Aspen. They've just come back from North Carolina, and before that it was San Diego, and before that it was Las Vegas. They're constantly flying all over the place. Meanwhile, they're about to lose their house. On page 462 of the Discovery documents, you get another sort of insight, a little peek into Shanann's life through Jeremy Lindstrom, where he says, Shan'ann is a person of habit and follows the same schedule every day. So it was strange to him when the girls didn't show up for their first day of school on Monday, 13th of August. Interestingly, a lot of people have said Monday wasn't their first day of school. I'm not sure whether people are confused about the normal schedule for other children, middle schoolers and so on, but it would be their first day of school at kindergarten, having come back from North Carolina. So that was really how it was. But from Chris Watts's point of view, and in terms of the murder, the fact that Shan'ann was a person of habit and followed the same schedule means that he could kind of anticipate what she was going to do. In a premeditated murder, he could anticipate that she wouldn't just change her plans and come home. She wouldn't cancel a trip. And because she'd made so many trips, he knew how long it would take her to get from the airport home. He knew what she would do when she arrived home from the airport. Going further, Jennifer Lindstrom said that Shan'ann is an avid Facebook poster, to the point that some people feel it is overkill. And anyone can go and look at Shanann's Facebook now and just look at how much of it is Thrive and how much isn't. And the same with Nicole Atkinson. Her Facebook is also still public, and it is Thrive, 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 all of it. And once I don't think it's an over-exaggeration to say, once you've seen one Thrive post, you've seen them all. They're all about the same thing. And all of it is really vacuous stuff. All of it is about how I'm super excited about this amazing bar that's so delicious. I'm super excited about this this powder. I'm super excited about this new skin patch. Look what a lovely color it is, and it's so exciting. All of them are really vacuous, and some people didn't like it. Some people who were exposed to it, who were friends on Facebook, unfriended because they didn't want the same vacuous stuff day in and day out. And doesn't it take a certain kind of person to be able to do this ad nauseum? Doesn't it take a certain kind of person to fill up their social media with the same vacuous crap all the time? And some of Shan'ann's stuff did have there's a little bit of heart here and there where she may talk about her children while she's doing it or something like that. But besides that, there's very little. There are very few moments on Shan'ann's Facebook that aren't monetized, put it that way. And that's also sad to see. There are very few just moments of the family laughing together, where there's not some kind of spiel at the end of it. Well, buy this powder, kind of thing. Inevitably, all the little promos are Shan'ann at the center, and then the family sometimes being extras in this spiel, and one can imagine doing that once, but can you imagine doing it every single day? Somebody telling everybody else about how wonderful your lives are every single day, meanwhile they're not that wonderful. Meanwhile you're struggling, and it's hard to get this person's attention. And in this respect, Jennifer said that Shan'ann likes to share everything, and it was very unusual when she hadn't posted anything on Facebook. And it's in this respect that it's very odd that Watts committed the crime in the way that he did. Didn't he know that people would miss Shan'ann on Facebook? Even after half a morning, didn't he know that people would quickly realize something was up? And this raises the possibility that Watts had access to Shan'ann's Facebook, and that he intended to sort of prolong and delay the knowledge that she died by kind of giving her a temporary afterlife by posting on her behalf on Facebook. And you can kind of imagine that just based on how cell phones work, you need to make those posts from home, because any analysis is going to show where they're made. So if Chris Watts had taken the phone out of the house and taken it to anywhere, the pings would have registered, and people would have known that he had her phone. But if he left her phone there, and he arrived back at the end of the day, and he said on Shan'ann's Facebook, he said, "I'm really upset, and just made some kind of fake message. He could have kept people in the dark for a short while, long enough to buy himself time. And we see the same thing happened with the Patrick Frazee case, which is by no means as open and shut as the Chris Watts case. And that in that case, the cell phone was used to artificially prolong the life of Kelsey Bereth. And even now, it's not 100% clear that Kelsey Bereth is dead. It's almost certain, but there's an element of doubt, and that's all someone needs to get someone off the hook. And the same could have happened in the Watts case. If Watts was able to make fake, just a handful of fake profile posts on Shan'ann's profile, he could have held all the people at bay, just where they were like, well, I'll get back to you when you're less upset. And then the question is, why didn't he? And the answer could be that he was locked out of her phone because she changed her password, or he ran out of time, or he forgot, or he made some dumb mistake, but that may have played into the premeditation. We will look at an aspect where it looks like he did have access to her Facebook account. It's unclear whether it means that he was just able to go to it because it's a public profile, or whether he could actually log into it. Obviously, if he could log into it, he could read her messages. He could read what maybe Nicole was saying to him on Facebook, and I think that's an aspect that's missing to some extent from the discoveries. What about the social media interactions? I'm talking about the direct messaging on Facebook. Didn't Nicole communicate with Shan'ann that way? Didn't Nicole Kessinger once upon a time communicate on her Facebook in that way? So when Jeremy and Jennifer say it was very out of character for Shan'ann to disappear, in part they're talking about her character on Facebook, the fact that she was ever present on Facebook. She was constantly on Facebook. And so for her to disappear, that kind of raised a kind of suspicion. And this in itself brings about a very weird irony with Thrive, and that is, because Shan'ann was constantly on Thrive, she kind of did have a community that knew about her, knew her habits, arguably cared about her. And so when she disappeared, this Thrive community kind of rallied to her cause, and so it's because of Thrive, because of the Thrivers like Nicole, that Chris Watts was ultimately caught. And so we in a way have Thrive to thank for the fact that Chris Watts was caught as quickly as he was, which is a weird thing to acknowledge. It's for me very sad, very disappointing that the case didn't go to trial, because you would most certainly have had experts weighing in on multi-level marketing and what that's all about, and what impact that had on Shan'ann, and what impact that could have had on the Watts family, and what impact that could have had or would have had on their finances. And they could have done like a forensic audit, and one could have seen exactly how much money they were making or losing, and that would have been news, I think, to America. Just that on black and white, this is the amount of money Shan'ann was making. I think everyone would have been interested. Everyone would have been interested to see exactly how much it was. Often in the Thrive videos that Shan'ann made, she would sort of say how much free time she had, and how wonderful Thrive was because she had so much time off, and for the first time she could sort of spend weekends, and she could go to concerts, and there was so much she could do. And yet on page 463 of the Discovery, you see Jeremy saying that Shan'ann works 24 hours a day on Thrive, where Jeremy says Shan'ann posts so much on Facebook that you feel like you are around her. And what this is saying is that far from being something that was liberating Shan'ann, to give her a sort of a life where she had a lot of leisure time, and she could be sort of free. It's actually the opposite. She was working constantly. She was kind of overworked, and one gets that impression when Shan'ann arrives back and you see her on the doorbell camera. You get the sense of dusk till dawn, overworked, exhausted. And the fact is, when Shan'ann left for that conference, she left very early in the morning, to catch her flight, she left, I think, before 6 o'clock in the morning. And she arrived back very, very late at night. Even if a flight had arrived on time, it would have been 11 p.m. on a Sunday night. She's spending her entire weekends at these conferences, away from her family, away from her children, and she's pregnant. So you're having these people working flat out and still having to sell their house. And in the case of the Wattses, you had Shan'ann even sort of, and I don't think this is actually allowed with multi-level marketing, but it looked like Shan'ann was also operating an account in Chris's name. She was posting on his behalf. So she was trying to double her money in that way as well, by being two promoters in one, right? Was it working? You know, did these schemes work for her? Again, just to come back to this idea that, you know, when the children are at a birthday party over the weekend and her husband's at a birthday party, Shanann's somewhere else. She's somewhere else in the country working. I mean, is that Thrive? Is that what thriving's all about? On page 463 of the Discovery, Jennifer Lindstrom said it was normal for Shan'ann to be out of town for a Thrive business, and that Chris takes care of the girls when she's gone. Really, so it's normal for Shan'ann to be out of town working, and then her husband must look after the children. He also works all week. But, you know, it's this idea of being constantly spread out and constantly working. It's like too little butter spread over too much bread. On page 531 of the Discovery, I think you have McKenna Lindstrom, the babysitter, talking about what Shan'ann does for a living, and she's a very sweet young girl, and she speaks in a very straightforward way. And so when Agent Kobach asked McKenna, so what does Shan'ann do, you get just the kind of obvious answer. You kind of get the obvious answer, unembellished, from a teenager who says, well, she's a promoter or an advertiser for Thrive. Now, if you think about that, what is it? It's kind of an advertising person for powders. And if you think about it, Shanann's Facebook is 90% that. It is advertising this powder, advertising that patch, advertising this thing and that. And so in effect, you're not really making money from advertising. You're making money selling, but ultimately your job is an advertiser. Thrive must love that. Thrive must be very happy that all these people are online promoting their products for nothing. In fact, they must pay to promote their products. They must pay to be allowed to be part of this community. Thrive must love that. All this free advertising, right? In the real world, people who work in advertising are paid. They're paid a daily wage, and I guess in some instances they get paid bonuses and commissions for new contracts that they secure, but they pay to do advertising. And of course, you have a handful of brand ambassadors for a particular brand in a particular market. In a city, you might just have a handful, and now you've literally got hundreds, even thousands of promoters and advertisers, and what they're doing, they're all promoting or advertising to each other. It doesn't really that model doesn't really work in the real world, and that's the problem, is these thrivers aren't in the real world. And that brings us to this whole idea of, is Thrive a vanity project? Is Thrive about narcissism? And what is it at the end of the day? It's talking about how great everything is in your life. You very happy, you very healthy, you've just had a wonderful day. You're driving a great car, and you're living in a big house, and it's happily ever after. And that's the standout feature of the Chris Watts case. And look at where Thrive drove this particular family. It really warped things. Don't you agree? It really took things to a certain point, and then they kind of got warped and bent out of shape. For me, what's kind of ironic is you will see Shan'ann doing the whole, she uses her house as a prop, and she uses her car as a prop to say, I'm rich, I'm successful, if you buy this stuff from me, if you become a thriver, you can have what I have. But the thing is, she doesn't even have it herself. She doesn't genuinely own that house in the proper sense of the word. She doesn't properly own the car in the proper sense of the word. We're going to deal with what the discovery says about the car as well, and their words. She doesn't properly own the marriage that she's in. Her husband's actually cheating on her. She doesn't properly own the health, neither do her children. That's also not true as well. And it becomes even more manifest, the sort of ridiculousness of Thrive, when you see her parents and his parents wearing the patches, and you sort of know for a fact that they aren't living in excess. They're living in modest little houses, and they quietly getting on with their lives. And as soon as you apply that extravagance with Thrive to the Ruseks and the Watts parents, it doesn't quite work. It falls a bit flat. It does work very well with the whole big house and big talk mindset of 2825 Saratoga Trail. There the Thrive really shines, and it really comes into its own. It's not true, but it sort of works better. If you imagine a very overweight person in a sort of very average setting, walking around with Thrive, it's not inspiring. You're not getting the sense that this person is a go-getter, or is very successful, or is enjoying a upswing in their lives, right? If it's someone who's muscle bound and looking great and in the shape of their lives, and they're driving a nice car, you almost get the sense that if you smoke this product, you're gonna get the same thing. And a lot of companies sell that. A lot of aspirational brands, whether it's cars or beers or whatever, sell that thing, and people like those associations. The thing with Thrive is it's almost taking that literally. It's saying, if you put this patch on your arm, your life will change. And Chris Watts certainly seemed to take that message literally, is that he wanted to thrive. He wanted his life to change. He wanted his happily ever after. And Thrive was saying, why can't you have what you want? Why can't you get what you want? Why can't you have the life that you deserve? And taking it literally, can you? Can you get the life you deserve by putting a patch on your shoulder? Should you get the life you deserve? And what is that? What is that if not a kind of a narcissism? And this brings us to Nicole's attitude to thrive, and this we can get from page 543 of the Discovery. This is the feelings of Nicole Kessinger. Nicole was quite a healthy person herself. She was fit, she went to gym, she worked out, she's in quite good shape. She cared about her appearance, she cared about eating healthily, and that's maybe what attracted her to Chris Watts, is she noticed this guy who transformed himself, and he was looking good. And he was physically in good shape, and so there seemed to be chemistry that developed between them more than anything else. And so on page 543, Kevin Kovac asks Nicole if Chris Watts used steroids or narcotics, and she then referenced Chris always using Thrive, and she said he always had 2 patches stuck to him all the time. And Watts told Nicole that Thrive helped him to lose weight. The interesting aspect with Nicole Kessinger is that she seemed to be a bit of a reality check with Watts, where she would tell him, for example, that she didn't really believe in the Thrive, and instead she wanted to give him advice on how to eat better, which he did. And this actually annoyed Shan'ann. Shan'ann didn't like the fact that he wanted to eat certain meals. And we even get a text between Watts and Josh Rosenberg where he talks about that. He talks about how eating better was making a real difference. But where did that come from? It came from Kessinger. And Kessinger went to the Watts home to help him with his diet plan. And Kessinger was certainly doing quite well in terms of her own fitness and health according to her own diet plan. And we know that Chris Watts actually lost even more weight than he already had between July and August. We know exactly how much he lost and when he lost it, and this seemed to be as a result of Kessinger's input. Not just that, Watts continuing to use the Thrive patches, but also Kessinger's input. So my impression is that Kessinger didn't think much of Thrive. She certainly, as much as she liked Chris Watts and was attracted to him, she didn't buy into the Thrive thing, and but he continued to buy into it, and that's quite an interesting difference of opinion, where she had her own ideas, but she didn't force him to stop what he was doing, and by the same token, he didn't try to force her onto Thrive himself. He saw that there was another way of living, another way of doing things, but he was probably so attached to the Thrive thing. Thrive had given him a new lease on life, and he wasn't about to give that up. Kessinger probably also mentored Watts to some extent on the money situation. She probably had her own, and unfortunately this isn't something that was brought up much in the interrogation. Nowhere that I can remember, maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, but nowhere can I remember did the interrogators ask Kessinger what she thought about multi-level marketing, and whether she thought Shan'ann was making money out of Thrive, right? On page 554, and it's the words in this statement that are so interesting. You see Detective Baumhover providing some insight, and one of the things he says is that he learned the Watts family had a leased white Lexus SUV, And I think those words speak volumes. This is part of the discovery. This is a proper official report from the lead detective in the case. And it's important that he gets the words exactly right. And what he says here is that the SUV was leased. Not that it was owned, that it was leased. And what that basically means is that they are renting a vehicle, which is possibly even more than what they would pay on paying it off. And isn't this also just for appearances, to show, look at what car I'm driving? But I don't really own it, I'm just leasing it. And in brackets, the detective writes, possibly paid for using a car allowance through Shan'ann's employment with Thrive. So what he's saying, and this is in italics, is saying, just look at the words. It's being paid for using a car allowance, right? So a certain amount of money is being made available, not paying for everything, but an allowance, which we know was based on, is the word concomitant, it was based on, it was predicated on Shan'ann hitting particular targets. So you're getting this car allowance, and then you paid the other amount, the balance, and all that amounted to was a monthly lease. And at the end of the day, what happened to the Lexus? The Lexus went back to the leasing agent. I covered this in one of the narratives, the particular leasing agent that it was. And so effectively, the Watts family didn't actually even own a car. They didn't properly even own the house. I mean, they were about to lose their house. So what did they own? Well, what they did own was they owned a lot of crap in the basement. And a lot of that crap was likely multi-level marketing merchandise like LuLaRoe garments and Thrive garbage and whatnot. Because the more you buy, the more you've got get kind of discounts on. So you buy more and more and more, and you spend more and more and more, and you end up with all this product, and you've now got to try and get rid of it. So moving on, we get to page 582 in the discovery, and this is dealing with Amanda Thayer. She was a director at Primrose School, and it's not clear whether Amanda got the whole. It seems as though Amanda got into the Thrive thing because Shan'ann recruited her, like everybody else. But the basic thing here is that Amanda worked down the line from Shan'ann. What is Thrive? It's selling vitamins and minerals that are plant-based. It's a 3-step system which includes capsules in the morning, a protein shake with water, and a patch you wear on your skin. Again, when we come back to the oxycodone thing, it's something that you do every single day, and it involves pills, powders, capsules, every single day. And one of the parts in this 3-step system is pouring powders into a protein shake bottle or container, and that's certainly the opportunity on a daily basis to put some kind of toxic agent, something like ground down oxycodone, into the protein shake. You wouldn't notice it if it's there, even if it didn't dissolve easily. You would just assume maybe those flakes of powder were sort of coagulated powder, pieces of powder or something like that. It then goes on to say Thrive is extremely healthy. Well, doctors tend to say that you shouldn't use Thrive while pregnant. So then it can't be all that healthy, can it? According to this, Watts weighed 245 pounds before he started using Thrive in 2016. So we can basically say that Thrive came into the Watts family in 2016. In other words, just following the bankruptcy. Right? The bankruptcy was in mid 2015. And so Thrive was in play for 2 years before the family were murdered, before the annihilation happened. So basically it took 2 years for Thrive to be absorbed, kind of ingested into the Watts dynamic, for the family to then be eviscerated. When we go to page 583, Watts said that Shan'ann used fertility drugs with Bella and Cece, but she wasn't using fertility drugs when she got pregnant with their third child. I wonder if that's true. I mean, maybe didn't know she was using fertility drugs, and she was. They only tried twice when Shan'ann got pregnant with their son. Shan'ann believed she got pregnant because she was using Thrive and had a much healthier lifestyle. That could be true. Shan'ann was looking in fairly good shape. It could be true that that she got pregnant because she was using Thrive, but it could also be true that this is something she was saying to sell Thrive. One can actually imagine her saying in a Thrive spiel that she's never been this healthy and she fell pregnant because she was using Thrive. So now Thrive is a lupus cure, it's a fertility drug, it's a lifestyle magic wand, it's conjure this luxury car into being which actually isn't theirs. Do you really believe that she got pregnant because she was using Thrive? That's an open question. Something that the discovery unfortunately doesn't address, and who knows, if there was a proper toxicology and proper checking up of Shan'ann's medical records, maybe that could actually be found out. Was she using fertility medication? Was there any in the house? Whatever. Just staying on the same page of the discovery, 583, there's a mention that the Thrive trip to San Diego happened at the end of June 2018, around about June 26th. If you take that Thrive event and the one in early August, basically August 10, 11 and 12, you basically have 6 weeks separating the one and the other. And just think about that. The frequency of these trips. I mean, there was another one to Las Vegas in February. So it's February, then March, April, May, then there's one in June and another one in August. There was also a Thrive conference in New Orleans in April. And so more than likely all of these trips are a lot like the car bonus. You get a car, but you pay for half of it as long as you hit your bonuses, and then when you don't get your allowance. And so these Thrive kind of free trips, reward trips, you have something that's given to you. You got some kind of travel allowance. It might be the accommodation that's on the house, but then you must pay for the flights and food. It's still an expense, just like the car. You're getting a bonus, but it's not without the expense, and it's and it's contingent on a certain level of sales. That's what we're talking about. On page 587 of the discovery, you actually have a dollar amount where Shan'ann is said to be making 65,000 to 70,000 a year with Thrive, and that is, I think, a statement made by Chris Watts. He also says that Shan'ann had about 200 people signed up under her. You know, when he says she made 65 to 70,000, I think on Shan'ann's Facebook page she identified herself as an 80k thriver. So it would actually be interesting to see what those numbers actually represent. If you an 80k level promoter, does that mean you've reached sales turnover of 80k? And knowing Thrive and knowing multi-level marketing, and it's all about talking up a big game, it's all about exaggeration, it's all about misleading and manipulating. I think it's more than likely that those amounts don't represent income, doesn't represent profit, it represents turnover. So your income is whatever that amount is minus what it costs to buy that and to distribute it, and so on. So, and then you've also got to take away the flights to these various events, one every third month basically, and then the cost of this car allowance that you've sort of forced to keep paying for this car, and you don't want to stop paying for it because then you've got to explain to your base why you not driving the fancy car that you've been gloating about all along. It would have been very interesting if the crime didn't happen and Shan'ann and Chris did move into another house, how they would have played that in terms of Thrive. You know, how do you explain that you're in another neighborhood in a smaller house? How do you explain that you are getting divorced? Do you just keep talking it up? You know, what is interesting is Shan'ann did post she actually didn't post it. I think she sent an image privately to a friend of hers showing how worn out she looked and, you know, how little sleep she was getting. And, you know, that kind of honesty she could have done a bit more on Facebook. She could have said, look guys, I'm struggling, and people could have come to her aid or whatever. But the whole point of Thrive is to hide that. You hide away the difficulty, you hide the struggles, you hide that kind of thing, and then you sell the fairy tale, and you try and get other people on board with your fairy tale. And you can't really sell them the nightmare, can you? So you just keep selling the fairy tale. And this brings us to point number 7, that Chris didn't need to sleep when he was on Thrive. Well, maybe he did. Maybe the fact that he would not sleep, but then he'd be speaking to Kissinger and then fall asleep while he was talking to her. That certainly doesn't sound like someone who's coping wonderfully without sleep. I think sleep deprivation plays a role in this crime. I think there were some clever aspects to the execution of this crime, and I think there were some incredibly stupid aspects to it. And doesn't that speak to the whole thing of sleep deprivation? You know, when you sleep deprived, you can make some really, really dumb mistakes. You know, you can be driving. I've certainly had it where you're driving and there's a shadow on the road, or a car sort of swings out in a way that you would normally just cognitively and consciously you know, you see it, it sort of computes and you take it in your stride. But when you sleep deprived, you're compromised and you overreact or you underreact. It's a little bit like being drunk. And I think Thrive may have gotten in the way of Watts' ability to think clearly. a very interesting aspect when we talk about this is, um, did 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 the Thrive patches help Watts when he gave his confession? You know, when he did the first confession, did the Thrive patches help him take on those two agents? Did they give him more energy than he otherwise would have had? Did they give him more mental um, energy than he otherwise would have had at his disposal? Right. One obvious way of testing this hypothesis is to say, well, how did his first confession compare to the second? And I think he did in terms of a criminal and in terms of his story. I think he did a much better job at lying during the first confession compared to the second. In the first confession, he sort of wriggled out of it at the end, saying that Shan'ann had done it. In terms of the second confession, he didn't really last very long. He basically got maneuvered into giving a version which was even less believable than the first. Just even less believable. Having said that, a lot of people have believed every version Watts has given. And when you say certain aspects are true, we're talking about very, very small little details in these aspects, not the general thrust of the confession. So, and then when you go to the third confession, which is essentially in the letter, when he had as much time as he needed, that's possibly even worse. Where he talks about the attempted murder and everything. That's even less believable than the two preceding it. So, a case can be made that when he was on Thrive, maybe it was wearing off during the first confession, but he had some mental resilience. He had the ability to sort of stay awake and focus to some extent. And then once that was gone, then it was really gone. And that brings us to the final point in this episode, which is the irony. And this is perhaps the biggest. When you talk about the fourth biggest what the F, there are a lot of things that stand out within that, but for me this point stands out kind of head and shoulders above all the others. And it's basically this idea that when Shan'ann was in a relationship with her first husband, Leonard King. Okay, and this comes from page 667 of the Discovery, and it refers to Leonard King, her first husband. And I'm going to read the particular excerpt. It's taken by CBI agent Galbraith, and I quote, "I asked Leonard about his relationship with Shan'ann. When their marriage was not going so well, Shan'ann poured herself into worked a lot, and stopped coming home at night. Leonard was unable to get details from her. Shan'ann would stay gone, but he was never concerned that something happened to her." Now, if you take all of that and you apply it to the end of Shan'ann's life and the murders, you have an inversion here, where when their marriage was not going so well, Shan'ann also poured herself into her work, this time with Thrive, worked a lot, and, well, didn't necessarily stop coming home at night, but she was away all the time. She was away in North Carolina, and she was away the weekend before she died. Where her husband was unable to get details from her, Shan'ann wasn't able to get details from her husband. She was trying to find out what was going on with him, and he kept saying to her, "It's all in my head and I will fix things." And so you had an ironic situation where when things went pear-shaped in her second marriage, Shan'ann jumped into her work and into all the schedules and all the regimented things and timetables, and then she couldn't get access to her husband. And where Shan'ann would stay gone, where Shan'ann was away from home for an extended period of time. This was a weird situation where she and her husband were apart, and in this case, her husband wasn't concerned that something had happened to her either. This was a situation where something had happened to her, but her husband was pretending not to be concerned. So it's just a very weird inversion of her first marriage, but this time Shan'ann's poured herself into work with Thrive and is working a lot with Thrive, and in this case it's not necessarily her that's responsible for ripping the marriage apart, it's her husband. Her husband wants to get divorced, her husband wants to go his separate way. An interesting question is, if Shan'ann wasn't pregnant, would she have wanted to divorce Chris Watts, given just how she was experiencing things? Now, I just want to take that question a little bit further. If Shan'ann wasn't pregnant, and she was aware of what she was aware of when she was aware of it, what would have happened? And I think the intuitive answer is Shan'ann would have been pushing for the divorce. Shan'ann would have wanted to kick Watts out of the house, but then have the house and then get the alimony and all that kind of thing. I think she would have been pushing for it, right? So it's almost as if the pregnancy itself put Shan'ann kind of on the defensive and made her vulnerable, whereas if the pregnancy wasn't there, maybe she would have been on the offensive and she would have wanted a divorce, and she would have kicked his sorry ass, as she once put it, out of the house, right? But I don't think you can get any more what the F. I don't think there's a greater irony and a greater oddity, a greater mismatch than this idea of Shan'ann spending the last moments of her life as part of like a big thriving thing. The whole idea of Thrive being successful, happy, well, living a fairy tale, living happily ever after. And then you look at that weekend where she was thriving and she was sick. She was worried her husband was cheating on her. She was run down. She was tired. And she was about to be murdered. Things couldn't have been darker or more desperate. And yet her final messages on Facebook were about thriving. Thank you for listening, and all of this analysis is covered in a lot more detail and in a lot more effective way, in a much tighter narrative, in the Two-Face series. I deal with the Thrive aspect to quite a large extent in the Two Pollyannas book, which also deals more specifically with the Thrive videos and you know what one can intuit from these videos besides Thrive. In other words, what we see about the family dynamics going on in the home through some of these Thrive themed videos. Again, thank you for listening. Please subscribe to the channel, like and leave a comment, and please share this video among your networks. Until the next episode, which will be dealing with the number 5 What the F in this series.